October 9th, 1942, 20,000 feet above a jungle island called Guadalcanal, Captain Daniel Cross was fighting for his life. He was flying a Grumman F-4 Wildcat, a stubby, heavy carrier-based fighter that felt like a truck with wings. Behind him, closing fast, was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane so light and agile, it seemed to defy the laws of physics. Cross had followed the doctrine perfectly. Never turn with a zero. The manual was clear. The experts in Washington had studied the numbers. The zero could turn inside a Wildcat's radius twice over. It could climb like a rocket. For the past year, the zero had been a ghost, a phantom, that owned the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. So Cross did exactly what he'd been trained to do. He pushed his Wildcat into a screaming dive. The heavy American plane gained speed quickly, 400 miles per hour. The ocean rushed up toward him, but the zero stayed with him, matched his dive, anticipated his every move. Cross rolled hard right. The Wildcat responded, but slowly, like trying to turn a loaded truck. The zero was already there, its 20-millimeter cannons winking orange fire. The cockpit exploded. Shrapnel tore through Cross's right leg. His instrument panel shattered. His controls went dead. The plane nosed over. He was going down. He managed to bail out at 3,000 feet, his parachute deploying just before he hit the shark-infested waters below. This was the reality of the air war in the Pacific in October 1942. This was Guadalcanal, the island the Marines called Henderson Field. The pilots called it the graveyard, and the doctrine that had saved pilots over Europe was getting men killed every single day in the South Pacific. But just weeks later, another farm boy would climb into the same sky and change everything. He wouldn't have a better plane. He wouldn't have secret intelligence. He would have something simpler, something the experts had forgotten. He would have the knowledge of how to hunt jackrabbits on a frozen South Dakota prairie. And that knowledge would rewrite the rules of air combat in the Pacific theater. This is the story of Joseph Keller, the man they called too old to fight, the man who proved that sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the simplest solutions. The man who became America's ace of aces, not by following the manual, but by remembering what his father taught him when he was 12 years old and couldn't afford to waste shotgun shells. If you or someone you love served in the Pacific during World War II, this story will remind you why that generation earned the title the greatest. This is about more than aerial combat. It's about the moment when experience defeated youth, when wisdom overcame technology, and when a farmer's eye proved sharper than an engineer's calculations. Before Joe Keller ever climbed into a fighter plane, before he ever saw combat, before the Navy told him he was too old to serve his country, he was simply a boy trying to keep his family fed during the worst economic disaster in American history. Joe Keller was born in 1915 on a remote farm 15 miles outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The farm had no electricity, no running water. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. His childhood wasn't spent in classrooms or playing games. It was spent in the dirt and the cold, and in the wind that never stopped blowing across those endless plains. His father, Henry Keller, was a hard man made harder by hard times. Henry had fought in the First World War. He'd seen the trenches. He'd come home to South Dakota because he wanted peace and quiet and land of his own. What he got was 160 acres of stubborn soil and a son who asked too many questions. But Henry Keller taught his son one thing that would change the course of history. He taught him how to hunt. It was the winter of 1927. Joe was 12 years old. The Great Depression hadn't officially started yet, but on the South Dakota prairie times were always hard. The family needed meat. They had 4 shotgun shells. Henry handed his son the old 12 gauge and said something Joe would remember for the rest of his life. Don't waste shells. We need 4 rabbits. The family eats or the family doesn't. Your choice. Joe had fired a gun before. Tin cans, fence posts, targets that didn't move. But jackrabbits don't stand still. They weave, they dart, they zigzag in patterns that seem random but follow their own logic. They know when you're aiming at them. And they're fast, faster than most people think. Joe's first shot missed. He'd aimed right at the rabbit, led it by what seemed like enough. The rabbit zagged left at the last instant, and the pellets hit dirt. 3 shells left, 3 rabbits needed. Henry didn't yell, didn't lecture. He just said 6 words. Don't aim where it is, aim where it's going. Joe watched the next rabbit, really watched it, studied how it moved. The pattern wasn't random. When a jackrabbit runs, it zigzags every 3 or 4 bounds. Always left, then right, then left again. An instinct developed over thousands of years to confuse predators. But if you knew the pattern, you could predict it. Joe aimed 2 feet ahead of where the rabbit was going to be. Not where it was, not where it had been, where it would be in the half-second it took for the pellets to cross the distance. He fired. The rabbit dropped. Henry nodded. That's it. That's the secret. Lead the target. Always lead the target. By the end of that afternoon, Joe had 4 rabbits, 4 shells, 4 kills. The family ate that week. Joe Keller had just learned deflection shooting. He didn't know that's what it was called. He just knew it worked. And over the next 6 years, as the Depression turned bad times into desperate times, Joe hunted to keep his family fed. He got so good at leading jackrabbits that he rarely missed. His younger brother and sister ate because Joe understood angles and timing and patience. These weren't skills learned from a book. They were survival knowledge beaten into his bones by necessity. In 1933, when Joe was 18, his father took him to a barnstorming air show that came through Sioux Falls. It was the first time Joe had ever seen an airplane up close. The Marine Corps had sent a squadron of biplanes to do aerobatics demonstrations. Recruiting event. Joe watched those planes roll and loop and spin, and something ignited in his chest. That's what I'm going to do, he told his father. Henry looked at his son. The farm needs you. I'll find a way to do both. Henry didn't argue. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, after the First War, when he decided he was going to marry Joe's mother despite having no money and no prospects. Stubbornness ran in the family, but fate had other plans. On a cold March evening in 1934, a spring storm rolled across South Dakota. Lightning, thunder, heavy rain. A power line came down across the fence line on the Keller property. Henry went out to fix it. He knew about electricity, knew it was dangerous, but the cattle needed to be kept in and the fence needed to be live. Joe found his father 2 hours later. Henry was lying in the mud, still holding the wire cutters. The current had stopped his heart instantly. Joe tried everything, tried to restart his father's breathing, tried chest compressions, tried praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Nothing worked. Henry Keller died in his son's arms in the mud, while the rain poured down and washed the blood from a cut on his forehead. Joe was 19 years old. He had a mother, a younger brother, and a younger sister. The farm had debts. The Depression was in full swing. The Dust Bowl was beginning. Joe Keller dropped out of high school 3 months before graduation. Someone had to run the farm. Someone had to be the man of the house. His dream of flying would have to wait. His family needed him. And Joe Keller, stubborn as his father, refused to let them starve. The next 6 years were a blur of work. Dawn to dusk farming, planting crops that failed, raising cattle that barely survived, hunting rabbits and deer, and anything else that could be eaten. And every night after everyone else was asleep, Joe sat at the kitchen table with books borrowed from the town library, teaching himself what he'd missed by leaving school. His mother, Martha, would find him there at 2 a.m. asleep with his head on an algebra textbook. "You're killing yourself," she'd say. "Dad wanted me educated. I'm finishing what he started." In 1940, after 6 years of night study, Joe Keller took the equivalency exam and earned his high school diploma. He was 25 years old. Most of his classmates had graduated 6 years earlier. Some had gone to college. Some had jobs in cities. Some had died in farm accidents or left for California to escape the dust. Joe had stayed, kept his promise, kept the farm running, kept his family fed, and he still wanted to fly. He took a job as a crop duster pilot to earn money for flight lessons. It was dangerous work, flying 10 feet off the ground, spraying pesticides over wheat fields, dodging power lines and fence posts. 2 of his fellow crop dusters died in crashes. But Joe was careful, patient. He remembered what his father taught him about leading targets. He anticipated where the plane would be, not where it was. By December 1941, Joe Keller had logged 127 hours of flight time. He had a commercial pilot's license. He had dreams of joining the military and flying fighters. He had skills that no academy could teach. And then on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Joe was working on a tractor when he heard the news over the radio. He dropped his wrench, ran to town, and tried to enlist in the Navy to become a carrier pilot. The recruiter looked at his application, looked at his birth date, looked up at Joe, and shook his head. "I'm sorry. The cutoff age for fighter pilots is 25. You're 26. Too old." Joe stared at the man. Too old. 26 years old and too old to serve his country, too old to fly fighters, too old to fight. The recruiter saw his expression. "Look, you've got flight experience. We can use you as an instructor. Train the younger guys. That's valuable too." Joe walked out of that recruitment office in a daze. He went back to the farm, went to the barn, and punched the wall hard enough to break 2 knuckles on his right hand. His mother found him there an hour later, his hands swelling, his eyes red. "The Navy's full of fools if they can't see what you are," she said. "What am I, Ma? A hunter? And hunters always find a way." Joe Keller might have given up then, might have accepted his fate as a flight instructor, might have spent the war teaching 20-year-old kids how to fly while other men went off to fight. But he had that Keller stubbornness, that refusal to quit, that his father had shown in the trenches and his mother had shown keeping the family together during the Depression. So Joe found a loophole. The Marine Corps Reserve had a slightly different age policy. They would accept pilots up to age 26 for reserve duty. Joe enlisted in January 1942, became a Marine, became a flight instructor. And for the next 9 months, he taught young men how to fly F-4F Wildcats at the training facility in Pensacola, Florida. It was the most frustrating time of his life. Every week, a new batch of students. Fresh-faced kids, most of them 20 or 21 years old. Joe taught them the basics: takeoffs, landings, formation flying, air combat maneuvers. And every month, those students shipped out to the Pacific, to Henderson Field, to the graveyard. And every month, Joe received letters from his former students, letters describing combat, letters describing the zero, letters describing men dying. One letter came from a young lieutenant named Tommy Nash, a kid from Ohio who'd been one of Joe's best students. The letter arrived in August 1942. "Mr. Keller, the Zero is nothing like what they told us in training. It can turn inside us every time. The manual says to dive away, but they're faster than we thought. They follow us down and they shoot us in the dive. I saw 3 men die yesterday. Good men. Men you trained. I don't think I'm coming home, Mr. Keller, but I wanted you to know you were a good teacher. You taught me everything I needed to know. It's just not enough." 2 weeks later, Joe received notification that Lieutenant Nash had been killed in action over Guadalcanal, shot down by a Zero, the 21st of Joe's students to die. Joe Keller walked into his commanding officer's office that afternoon. The commanding officer was a major named William Harrison, Duke Harrison, an Annapolis graduate, by-the-book, career officer. He told Joe multiple times that instructors were more valuable than combat pilots. Joe stood at attention in front of Harrison's desk. "Sir, I'm requesting immediate transfer to a combat squadron." Harrison didn't look up from his paperwork. "Request denied. We've been over this, Keller. You're needed here." "Sir, with respect, I just lost another student. 21 dead, all of them using tactics that don't work against the Zero. The tactics are sound. The men need more training. The tactics are wrong, sir, and more training won't fix that." Harrison finally looked up. His expression was hard. "Are you questioning naval aviation doctrine?" "Captain, I'm questioning doctrine that's getting my students killed, sir." "Careful, Keller. That's insubordination. Then write me up, sir. Court-martial me. But I'm not standing here while kids I train die following a manual that doesn't work." Harrison stared at Joe for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to his window, looked out at the training field where young pilots were practicing. "You really think you can do better out there? I think I won't know unless I try, sir." Harrison was quiet for another 30 seconds. Then he turned back to Joe. "I'll make some calls. No promises." Joe left that office not knowing what would happen. Court-martial, transfer, nothing at all. 3 days later, he got his answer. Transfer orders, VMF 121, Marine Fighting Squadron 121, destination Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Harrison called him in one last time before he shipped out. "I pulled a lot of strings for this, Keller. Don't make me regret it." "I won't, sir." Harrison held out his hand. Joe shook it. "Prove me wrong about the manual," Harrison said quietly. I hope to God you can. Joe Keller arrived at Guadalcanal on October 1st, 1942. The C-47 transport touched down on a runway that was more pothole than pavement. The moment the cargo door opened, the smell hit him. Thick, humid, a mix of engine oil, rotting jungle vegetation, and death. The smell of a place where men died every day, and there wasn't time to properly bury them all. He climbed out into blazing heat. The temperature was over 100 degrees. The humidity made it feel like breathing through a wet towel, and everywhere he looked, he saw wreckage. Planes pushed to the sides of the runway, F-4F Wildcats with their wings torn off, P-400 Airacobras with their tails shot away, fuselages riddled with bullet holes, cockpits stained with blood that had turned brown in the sun. This was Henderson Field. This was the place his students had been dying. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. A jeep pulled up. A sergeant climbed out. Sergeant Mike Walsh, crew chief, mid-30s, looked 50, yellow-skinned from atabrine, the anti-malaria medication that turned everyone the color of jaundice. His eyes were bloodshot. His flight suit was stained with grease and sweat, and God knew what else. Captain Keller, that's me. Welcome to paradise. Let me show you to your accommodations. The accommodations turned out to be a tent with a mud floor and mosquito netting that had more holes than net. 6 cots, 3 of them empty, the other 3 occupied by men who looked like ghosts. Their faces were yellow from atabrine. Their eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. Their hands shook even when they weren't doing anything. These were the survivors, the lucky ones who hadn't been shot down yet. One of them looked up when Joe walked in. He was young, maybe 21, thin as a rail. His flight suit hung off him like it was 2 sizes too big. New meat, he said. No emotion in his voice, just stating a fact. Captain Joe Keller. The young man didn't offer his hand, just nodded. Marcus Dalton. Everyone calls me Scarecrow. You'll figure out why. Another man sat up on his cot. Older, maybe 25, dark hair, calm eyes that didn't match the rest of the chaos in the tent. Robert O'Malley. They call me Preacher because I say my prayers before every mission. You should too. I'm not much for praying, Joe said. You will be. Preacher lay back down. You'll start praying real quick around here. Joe was assigned his plane the next morning, an F-4F-4 Wildcat, tail number 13. Sergeant Walsh walked him out to it. Last 2 pilots of this bird didn't make it back, Walsh said. No sugarcoating it, just facts. Joe walked around the plane. It was stocky, heavy-looking. The engine was big. The cockpit was small. The wings were short and stubby. It looked like exactly what it was. A tough, reliable truck of an airplane. Not fast, not agile, but built to take punishment. 13, huh, Joe said. Walsh shrugged. Numbers are just numbers, sir. What matters is who's flying it. Joe climbed up to look in the cockpit. 650 caliber machine guns. 3 in each wing. Good firepower. Decent armor plating behind the seat. Not as fast as a Zero, not as maneuverable, but it could take a hit and keep flying. She'll do, Joe said. That afternoon there was a briefing. All the pilots crammed into a wooden shack they called the pagoda. The intelligence officer stood at a blackboard with a piece of chalk. The Mitsubishi A6M0, he said, drawing a rough outline. Superior to the Wildcat in almost every measurable way. Faster climb rate, tighter turn radius, better range, 20mm cannons that will tear you apart if they connect. He drew another plane. The Wildcat. Your advantages, armor. The Zero has almost none. Yours will keep you alive if you get hit. Firepower. 650s can shred a Zero if you get solid hits. And one more thing. You can dive faster than they can, and you can roll faster than they can. He wrote in big letters on the blackboard, never turn with a Zero. This is the doctrine, gentlemen. This is what will keep you alive. You see a Zero, you do. You shoot on the way down, you use your speed and your armor, and you get the hell out. You do not under any circumstances try to outturn them. Because you can't. And if you try, you die. Joe watched the other pilots nodding. They'd heard this before. They knew the doctrine. But Joe was doing math in his head. The same math he'd done when he was 12 years old and trying to figure out how to hit a zigzagging jackrabbit. The manual was telling them to run away, to never engage on the Zero's terms, to always fight defensively. But Joe Keller hadn't kept his family fed during the Depression by running away from rabbits. He'd fed them by understanding how the rabbits moved, by predicting where they'd be, by shooting at empty air and letting the rabbit run into the bullets. The briefing ended. Joe walked back to his tent. Preacher fell into step beside him. "You're thinking something," Preacher said. "I can see it on your face." "Just a processing," Joe said. "That doctrine, it works about half the time, which means half the time it doesn't. What happens the other half, you end up like Cross, or worse." Cross was the pilot Joe had heard about. Shot down on October 9th, followed the doctrine perfectly, dived away from the Zero, and got shot down anyway because the Zero followed him into the dive and shot him in the cockpit. The doctrine wasn't wrong exactly. It was incomplete. It assumed the enemy would behave a certain way. But the Japanese pilots had adapted. They'd learned to follow wildcats into dives. They'd learned to bait the Americans into making mistakes. The Americans hadn't adapted back. That night, Joe couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the stifling heat, listening to Scarecrow toss and turn with nightmares, listening to Preacher mumble prayers in his sleep. And he thought about jackrabbits. A rabbit runs in patterns, left, right, left. If you chase the rabbit, you'll never catch it. If you aim at where it is, you'll miss. But if you aim at where it's going to be, you can hit it every time. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat, more agile, better in a turning fight, but it still had to follow the laws of physics. It still had to move in predictable ways. And if Joe could predict where it was going to be, he didn't need to outturn it. He just needed to put his bullets in the right place at the right time. It was the same principle as deflection shooting. Lead the target, don't aim at it, aim where it's going. Nobody had taught this to the fighter pilots. The doctrine was all about energy management and dive tactics and using the Wildcat's strengths. All good ideas, but they were missing the fundamental concept that Joe had learned when he was 12. You don't hit a moving target by chasing it. You hit it by being where it's going to be. The next morning, October 10th, Joe flew his first combat mission. He was assigned as wingman to a veteran pilot. Just observe, learn the ropes, don't do anything stupid. They took off at dawn, 8 Wildcats, patrol the area north of Guadalcanal. Watch for Japanese bombers coming down from Rabaul. At 15,000 feet, the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Joe looked up and to his left. There they were, 6 Zeros diving out of the sun. They'd been waiting, patient, predators. The veteran pilot Joe was supposed to follow immediately pushed into a dive. The doctrine, dive away, use your speed, but 2 of the other Wildcats didn't react fast enough. The Zeros got behind them, and then Joe watched something that made his blood run cold. One of the Wildcat pilots tried to turn, tried to shake the Zero on his tail. The doctrine said, don't turn, but when you have a Zero shooting at you, instinct takes over. You turn, you try to evade. The Wildcat turned. The Zero turned inside him effortlessly, got the perfect angle, fired. The Wildcat's wing exploded. The plane rolled inverted and went straight down. No parachute. The pilot's name was Brooklyn. Joe had met him the day before. 23 years old, from New York. He'd been in the Pacific for 5 weeks. Now he was dead. Joe followed his flight leader down. They got away. The Zeros didn't pursue. They'd gotten their kill. That was enough for them. When they landed back at Henderson Field, Joe sat in his cockpit for a long time. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger. Brooklyn had died because he tried to turn. But what else was he supposed to do? Let the Zero shoot him in the back, the doctrine said, dive away. But the Zeros were following into dives now. The doctrine said never turn, but if you didn't turn, you just died with your back to the enemy. The doctrine was wrong, or at least it was incomplete. That night, Joe sat in his tent with a pencil and paper. He started drawing. Rabbit paths, angles of deflection, lead calculations. Preacher watched him for a while. What are you working on, hunting strategy, Joe said. Preacher raised an eyebrow. We're not hunting. We're surviving. Joe looked up. That's the problem. We're thinking like prey. We need to think like hunters. The next day was October 11th. No combat, just patrol. But Joe spent every minute in the air studying, watching how the Wildcat responded, how fast it rolled, how it climbed, how it dove. He was learning his plane the same way he learned to hunt rabbits, by understanding its capabilities, its patterns, its nature. On October 12th, Joe requested a meeting with Major Duke Harrison. Harrison had been transferred to Guadalcanal the same time as Joe. Different squadron, but he was now the operations officer for all the fighter squadrons at Henderson Field. Joe walked into Harrison's tent at 10 p.m. Harrison looked up from a mountain of paperwork. "Keller, what do you need permission to speak freely, sir? We're in a tent on an island that's being bombed every night. I think we're past formalities." "Speak. The doctrine is wrong," Joe said. Harrison put down his pen. Carefully. "That's a bold statement. It's getting men killed, sir. I watched Brooklyn die yesterday. He followed the doctrine, tried to dive away. The Zero followed him. He turned. The Zero was faster. He died. The doctrine says never turn. The doctrine doesn't account for what happens when the enemy adapts, sir. The Japanese pilots have learned to follow us into dives. They've learned to bait us into turns. We keep doing the same thing. They keep killing us. So what's your solution?" Captain Joe pulled out his notebook, the one with the rabbit diagrams. He opened it on Harrison's desk. "We stop running. We stop reacting. We start predicting." Harrison looked at the drawings. "Rabbits, jackrabbits, sir. I grew up hunting them. They're fast. They zigzag. If you chase them, you'll never hit them. If you aim at them, you'll miss. But if you aim at where they're going to be, you hit them every time." Harrison looked up. "You're comparing Zero fighters to rabbits. I'm comparing the principle, sir. The Zero is faster than us in a turn. We can't outturn them. But we don't have to. We just have to know where they're going to be and put our bullets there first. That's deflection shooting. We teach that in basic gunnery. We teach it for shooting at bombers, sir. Straight and level targets. But nobody's teaching it for dogfighting. Nobody's teaching pilots to lead a turning target." Harrison leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Tomorrow's patrol. I'm making you flight leader." Joe blinked. "Sir, you get 4 planes, you run them however you want. If your rabbit hunting gets someone killed, I ground you, and you spend the rest of the war counting inventory in a warehouse. If it works, we'll talk. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Joe left that tent knowing he'd just been given a chance. A test. He could prove his theory, or he could get men killed. That night, he briefed his flight. 4 pilots, himself, Preacher, Scarecrow, and a pilot called Tex, a loud Texan who thought he was invincible. "Tomorrow we do things differently," Joe said. "No more diving away and hoping. We're going to use deflection shooting. We're going to shoot where they're going, not where they are." Scarecrow looked skeptical. "How do we know where they're going?" "And we watch. We learn their patterns. A Zero pilot turning left will almost always reverse right if you pressure him. He's trying to get angles. He's thinking we'll follow the turn, but we're not going to follow. We're going to shoot at where he'll be when he reverses." Tex laughed. "That sounds like horse shit, Captain." "Then you can fly someone else's wing tomorrow," Joe said calmly. "I need people who trust the method." Tex stopped laughing. Preacher spoke up. "I'll fly your wing, Joe. You haven't steered me wrong yet." Scarecrow nodded slowly. "I'm in." Tex shrugged. Hell might as well die trying something new. October 13th, 1942. The day that would change everything. Joe Keller was about to lead his first combat patrol. He wasn't following the manual. He was following 30 years of farm-learned instinct. In the next 48 hours, he would either be dead or he would prove that sometimes the answer to the most complex problem is the simplest lesson a father can teach his son. The Zeros were waiting, but so was the rabbit hunter. October 13th, 1942, 10:47 a.m. Joe Keller led his 4-plane division north from Henderson Field at 15,000 feet. The morning sun was already brutal, turning the cockpit into an oven. Sweat soaked through his flight suit, but Joe's hands were steady on the stick. His eyes scanned the empty blue sky with the patience of a man who'd spent years waiting for rabbits to emerge from tall grass. Preacher flew on his right wing tight formation. Scarecrow and Tex were behind them, weaving slightly, watching their 6 o'clock. The radio crackled with static and occasional position reports from other flights, but mostly silence, the kind of silence that comes before violence. They'd been airborne for 23 minutes when it happened. "Bandits, 11 o'clock, high Tex called, his voice tight. 6 of them." Joe looked up and left. There they were, 6 Mitsubishi Zeros in a loose formation escorting 2 Betty bombers. The Zeros were painted the same green-gray as every other Japanese fighter. But to Joe, they looked like jackrabbits, fast, agile, predictable if you knew what to look for. All aircraft, Joe said calmly into his radio. We go high. Get the sun behind us. Do not engage until I call it. Tech started to protest. The doctrine said to dive on them, hit them fast, then dive away. But Joe had made it clear before takeoff. His rules or no flight. They climbed. The Wildcats were slower climbers than Zeros, but Joe had started with an altitude advantage. He pushed his plane upward, watching the Zeros below. The Japanese pilots saw them, started to react. 2 Zeros peeled off from the bomber escort and started climbing to engage. Joe watched them come, studied their movement. 1 Zero was aggressive, climbing hard and fast. The other was more cautious, staying lower, probably planning to catch any Wildcat that dove away. The pattern, Joe thought. They're setting a trap. Aggressive one baits us. Cautious one kills us when we commit. He keyed his radio. Preacher, you're with me on the aggressive one. Text Scarecrow, you take the cautious one when he commits. Stay high until he does. Roger, came 3 replies. The aggressive Zero was closing. 500 yards, 400. Joe could see the pilot now, a dark shape in the cockpit. The Zero pulled its nose up, trying to get a high-angle shot. This was the moment. The doctrine said, dive away, use speed, get out. Joe did the opposite. He rolled his Wildcat inverted and pulled. The heavy fighter protested, mushing slightly, but it came around. Now he was diving, but not away. He was diving at an angle, cutting across the Zero's predicted flight path, not where the Zero was, where it would be in 2 seconds when it completed its climbing turn. The Zero pilot focused on getting his nose up to shoot at where Joe had been, didn't see the trap until it was too late. Joe lined up his gun sight, not on the Zero, on a patch of empty blue sky 200 feet ahead of it. His thumb found the trigger on his stick. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Lead it, more. You think you'll miss. Lead it more. Joe fired. 650 caliber machine guns erupted. The sound was deafening even through his helmet. The Wildcat shuddered from the recoil. Tracers arced out in a long stream, and for half a second, it looked like Joe had wasted ammunition shooting at nothing. Then the Zero flew directly into the stream of bullets. The effect was catastrophic. The Zero's right wing simply came apart, metal and fabric shredding under the impact of dozens of 50 caliber rounds. The plane snap-rolled to the right out of control and began tumbling toward the ocean 20,000 feet below. Joe didn't watch it fall. He was already scanning for the next threat. Preacher, you clear, boss. Preacher sounded shaken. How did you know where to shoot later? Joe banked hard left. Below him, Tex and Scarecrow were engaging the cautious Zero. Or rather, the Zero was engaging them. It had climbed after Scarecrow was on his tail, firing. Scarecrow, break right, Joe called. Scarecrow rolled right. The Zero followed, predictable as sunrise. Joe already had his nose pointed at the intercept point. He didn't aim at the Zero. He aimed at the circle of sky the Zero was turning into. Let it. Fired a 2-second burst. The Zero flew into it like a moth into a candle flame. Cockpit shattered. The plane nosed over and went straight down. 2 kills in under 30 seconds. The remaining 4 Zeros saw what happened and did something Joe hadn't expected. They dove away, disengaged, ran. The hunters had suddenly become uncertain. Joe's radio exploded with chatter. Holy hell, Tex was saying. Did you see that? He shot at empty air and they just flew into it. Scarecrow's voice quieter. That shouldn't be possible. Joe keyed his mic. All aircraft reform on me. We're going home. But sir, Tex protested. We can chase them. Negative. We accomplished the mission. We're not pressing our luck. On the flight back to Henderson Field, Joe's hands started shaking. Not from fear, from the realization of what had just happened. It had worked. The deflection shooting, the rabbit hunting logic, it had actually worked in combat against the so-called invincible Zero. He'd proven something. The doctrine wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. You didn't beat the Zero by running away. You beat it by thinking 3 moves ahead, by shooting where it was going, not where it was. They landed at Henderson Field 20 minutes later. The ground crews were already swarming the planes. Sergeant Walsh climbed up to Joe's cockpit. Sir, you got 2 confirmed kills. First mission. That's Walsh paused, searching for words. That's something. Just got lucky, Joe said, unbuckling his harness. Walsh looked at the gun camera film counter. Fired 3,000 rounds total. 2 kills. That's not luck, sir. That's shooting. Word spread fast on Guadalcanal. There wasn't much else to do except fight, sleep, and talk. By evening, half the pilots on the island had heard about the new guy who'd shot down 2 Zeros on his first combat mission by aiming at empty sky. Major Duke Harrison found Joe in the mess tent that night. Joe was eating canned hash that tasted like cardboard soaked in grease. Harrison sat down across from him. I watched the gun camera footage, Harrison said without preamble. Twice. Joe kept eating, didn't say anything. You fired at points in space where there was nothing, and the Zeros flew into your fire. Both times. That's deflection shooting, sir. Same principle as hitting a moving target on the ground. I've never seen it applied like that in air combat. Maybe nobody thought to try it, Joe said. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then I'm assigning you as flight instructor. Effective immediately, you're going to teach this to every pilot in VMF 121. Joe looked up. Sir, I just got here. I've flown 1 combat mission, and you got 2 kills without taking a single hit. The average pilot here lasts 11 days. You just proved there's a better way. I'm not waiting around for you to perfect it on your own time. You are going to teach it. Now. Joe put down his fork. How many pilots? 12 to start. Your flight plus 8 others. Volunteers. What if they don't volunteer? Harrison smiled grimly. I'll make it mandatory. You start tomorrow morning. Oh, 600. And Keller. Sir, the doctrine still stands officially. I can't change that. But unofficially, you're going to teach these men how to survive. How you do that is up to you. That night, Joe barely slept. Not from nerves, from planning. He'd never taught aerial combat before. Hell, he'd only flown 1 combat mission. But he understood the principle. And if he could teach it clearly enough, simply enough, maybe he could save some lives. The next morning at 6 a.m., 12 pilots gathered in the pagoda. They ranged in age from 20 to 30. Most of them looked like walking dead men. Yellow skin from atabrine, sunken eyes from malaria and exhaustion. Hands that shook when they held their coffee cups. Joe stood at the front with a piece of chalk and a blackboard. Gentlemen, my name is Captain Joe Keller. Some of you call me Old Joe. Some call me the new guy who got lucky yesterday. I'm here to teach you something that might keep you alive. One pilot, a hard-looking veteran named Cherokee, spoke up. With respect, Captain, we've all been through gunnery training. We know deflection shooting. You know it for shooting at bombers, Joe said. Straight and level targets, big slow targets. But when's the last time you used deflection shooting in a turning dogfight? Silence. Never, right, because the doctrine says don't turn with Zeros. And that's good advice, except the Zeros don't cooperate. They force you into turning fights, whether you want them or not. So you need to know how to shoot in a turning fight without actually turning with them. Joe drew a simple diagram on the blackboard. A circle representing a Zero's turning path. A straight line representing a Wildcat's trajectory. An X marking the intercept point. This is called a deflection shot. You're not aiming at where the target is. You're aiming at where it will be. The bullet has to travel. The target has to travel. They meet at the same point in space at the same time. Scarecrow raised his hand. How do you calculate the lead in your head while you're being shot at? You don't calculate, Joe said. You feel it. Same way you throw a football to a receiver. You don't do math. You see where he's running, you throw where he's going to be, and it works, Tex snorted. That's not exactly scientific. No, Joe agreed. It's not. It's instinct. An instinct is faster than calculation, but you have to train the instinct. Anyone here ever hunt birds? Duck, hunting, 3 hands went up, including Cherokee. When you shoot a duck, Joe said, do you aim at the duck? Cherokee shook his head. You lead it, aim ahead of it. How far ahead? Depends on range, speed, angle. Exactly. And you figure that out. How? Math? Cherokee smiled slightly. Experience. You miss a few, you adjust, you learn. That's what we're going to do here. Learn by doing. We're going to go up today and practice on towed targets. You're going to miss a lot, but you're going to learn how much to lead. And once your body learns it, you won't have to think about it. Over the next week, Joe trained his squadron relentlessly. Every morning, flights of Wildcats would take off and practice shooting at fabric sleeves towed behind other aircraft. The first day was humiliating. Experienced combat pilots missing target after target because they kept aiming at the sleeve instead of ahead of it. But Joe was patient. He'd spent years learning to hit rabbits. He knew that this kind of shooting couldn't be rushed. It had to become muscle memory. Scarecrow was the fastest learner. The young pilot from Kansas had grown up duck hunting. He understood instinctively how to lead a moving target. By the third day of training, he was hitting the target sleeve consistently. Lead more, Scarecrow would tell the others. More than you think. When you think you're going to miss, lead even more. Preacher was slower to pick it up, but he was methodical. He kept a notebook and wrote down every shot. Range angle, lead distance. After 50 practice runs, he started to see the patterns. Started to hit. Even Tex, the cocky Texan who'd initially dismissed the whole thing as horseshit, started to believe when he got his first consistent hits on day 4. But Joe wasn't just teaching deflection shooting. He was teaching tactics to support it. He introduced something he called the thatch weave, named after a tactic he'd read about that used pairs of aircraft weaving back and forth to protect each other. The principle was simple. 2 Wildcats fly in a loose formation, weaving in and out. When a Zero attacks one Wildcat, the other is already positioned to get a deflection shot on the Zero as it commits to the attack. Joe demonstrated it with Preacher. They flew mock dogfights against Tex and Scarecrow. The first few attempts were chaos, planes getting in each other's way. But by the end of the week, they had it down. A choreographed dance of mutual protection. Cherokee, watching from the ground, said what everyone was thinking. This changes everything. We're not flying solo anymore. We're flying as a unit. Joe nodded. A Zero can beat one Wildcat in a turning fight almost every time. But it can't beat 2 Wildcats who are working together and know how to lead their shots. On October 16th, 8 days after Joe's first combat mission, VMF 121 got a chance to put the training into practice. A massive Japanese strike force was inbound. Intelligence estimated 32 aircraft, bombers and fighters. Henderson Field could put up 12 Wildcats. 8 of them were Joe's newly trained squadron. The other 4 were from different units still flying by the old doctrine. Joe stood in front of his men in the pre-mission brief. This is it, gentlemen, everything we've practiced. Remember, you don't chase them, you don't turn with them. You predict where they're going, and you put your bullets there first. Fly in pairs, weave, cover each other, and trust your training. Scarecrow looked pale but determined. Preacher was praying quietly. Tex was grinning like a madman. Cherokee was calm as stone. Joe looked at each of them. Bring each other home. That's the mission. Understood. 12 voices answered as one. Yes, sir. They took off at 1400 hours, climbed to 18,000 feet, and waited. The Japanese came from the northwest, a massive formation. Joe counted 28 aircraft, Betty bombers in the center, Zeros weaving above and around them as escort. All aircraft, Joe called. We go in pairs. Preacher, you're with me. Scarecrow, Tex together. Cherokee, you've got Brooklyn's new replacement. Everyone else pair up. Remember the weave? Let's go to work. Joe rolled his Wildcat and dove. Not at the Zeros. At the intercept point where the Zeros would have to turn if they wanted to engage him. Preacher followed slightly higher and offset. The first Zero took the bait. Saw Joe diving, turned hard to intercept. The Japanese pilot was good. Veteran. He rolled his Zero into a perfect pursuit curve leading Joe's flight path. But Joe wasn't where the Zero expected. He'd already started his next move, a climbing roll, that brought him perpendicular to the Zero's turn. The Zero pilot tried to follow, pulling hard. Now Joe called. Preacher, who'd been waiting in position, fired. A 3-second burst, not at the Zero, at the point in space where the Zero's turn would take it. The Zero flew into the bullets and came apart. Wings folding, fuselage breaking. It tumbled out of the sky, trailing fire in pieces. One down. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was on Scarecrow's tail. Joe saw it happening. Saw Scarecrow weaving, trying to shake the pursuit. But the Zero was faster, getting angles. Scarecrow, hard right, Joe called. Scarecrow rolled right. The Zero followed, predictable. Joe was already diving, cutting off the Zero's turn. He didn't aim at the Zero. He aimed 300 feet ahead, where simple geometry said the Zero had to be if it maintained its turn. He fired. The Zero exploded, not from hitting it directly, but from flying through Joe's wall of 50 caliber fire. The plane disintegrated. 2 down. The air battle became a swirling chaos. Wildcats and Zeros mixing in a three-dimensional knife fight. But Joe's squadron was different. They weren't chasing. They weren't panicking. They were executing their training. Cherokee got a Zero with a perfect high-side deflection shot, firing down into the Zero's turn and catching it right in the engine. Tex got one by baiting it into chasing him, then having his wingman shoot it off his tail with the thatch weave. Even Scarecrow, the nervous farm kid from Kansas, got his first kill. A Zero tried to zoom climb away. Scarecrow, instead of chasing it up, fired at where the top of the zoom would be. The Zero climbed right into the bullets. Stalled. Fell. 10 minutes after the fight began, it was over. The Japanese bombers had turned back. The Zeros were disengaging. Final tally: 5 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed. 0 American losses. Joe's radio was chaos. Pilots whooping and hollering. The ground controllers asking for confirmation. The other flights asking what the hell VMF 121 had just done. Joe keyed his mic. All aircraft form up. We're going home. As they flew back to Henderson Field, Joe felt something he hadn't felt since before his father died. Pride. Not in himself, in his students. They'd learned, they'd executed, they'd survived, and more than that, they'd won. The next morning, a war correspondent was at Henderson Field. He'd heard about the engagement, wanted to interview the pilots. Joe tried to avoid him, but the reporter tracked him down. Captain Keller, the reporter said, notebook in hand. The ground crews are calling your squadron Keller's Flying Circus. How does that make you feel? Joe shrugged. I don't care what they call us. I care that my men came home. Is it true you learned this technique hunting rabbits as a child? Deflection shooting applies to any moving target. Rabbits ducks enemy aircraft. The principle is the same. The reporter scribbled notes. This is incredible. The old man teaching the young bucks how to hunt. How old are you, Captain 27? The reporter looked up. 27. And they're calling you the old man. Joe smiled slightly. Fighter pilot years are like dog years. I'm ancient. The story ran in Stars and Stripes 2 days later. Headline: Old Man outfoxes Zeros with rabbit hunting trick. Joe hated it, but the nickname stuck. Old Joe, the ancient 27-year-old who'd revolutionized aerial combat in the Pacific. His kill count started to climb. October 18th, 2 more Zeros. October 20th, 1. October 23rd, 3 in a single engagement. October 25th, 2 more. By the end of October, Joe Keller had 11 confirmed kills. He was officially an ace. And more importantly, his squadron had the lowest casualty rate of any unit at Henderson Field. But success draws attention, and attention from the Americans meant attention from the Japanese. In late October, at the Japanese airbase in Rabaul, intelligence officers were analyzing combat reports. One name kept appearing in intercepts of American radio communications. Keller, Old Joe, the ghost who shoots at empty sky. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada was called into a briefing. Yamada was 29 years old, a veteran of the China campaign, 14 confirmed kills, one of the most skilled Zero pilots in the Imperial Navy. His commanding officer spread photographs on the table. American Wildcats, gun camera footage showing impossible deflection shots. We have a problem, the commander said. The Americans have developed a new tactic. They're no longer running from our Zeros. They're engaging and winning. Yamada studied the images. This pilot, he said, pointing to gun camera footage of a specific Wildcat, he doesn't aim at us. He aims ahead of us. That's their technique. They call it deflection shooting. Yamada frowned. We were taught deflection shooting too. Every pilot learns it, but not like this. He paused, searching for words. This is mastery. Find this pilot, the commander said. The one they call Keller. Find him and kill him. He's disrupting our entire operation. Yamada looked at the footage again, studied the way the Wildcat moved. Patient, deliberate, not aggressive, calculating. He's a hunter, Yamada said quietly. What, this pilot? He's not fighting like a warrior. He's hunting like a predator. There's a difference. Yamada left the briefing with orders. Eliminate Keller. But as he walked back to his quarters, he felt something unusual. Not anger, respect. This American, whoever he was, had turned a disadvantage into an advantage. had taken an inferior aircraft and made it deadly through pure skill. That was something Yamada understood. He'd been a rice farmer before the war, had been drafted, had learned to fly out of necessity, not passion. He and this American were probably not that different, but war was war, and Yamada had his orders. On November 1st, Yamada led an 8-plane zero formation against Henderson Field. He'd studied every report about Keller, knew his tactics, knew he favored deflection shots from high angles, knew he flew with a wingman in a weaving pattern. So Yamada adapted. When they spotted 6 Wildcats at 15,000 feet, Yamada didn't attack in the standard way. Instead, he split his formation. 4 Zeros went high, 4 stayed low. If the Wildcats climbed to engage the high group, the low group would catch them. If they dove at the low group, the high group would catch them. It was a trap designed specifically for pilots who thought 3 moves ahead. Joe saw it immediately, recognized the pattern. These weren't normal zero tactics. This was something new. Someone on the Japanese side had studied him. All aircraft, he called. Split formation is a trap. We stay together and force them to commit first. But one of the other Wildcat pilots, not from Joe's trained squadron, didn't listen. He saw an easy target in the low group and dove at it. Immediately, 2 Zeros from the high group dove on him. He tried to dive away. They followed. He tried to turn. They were faster. He was shot down in less than 10 seconds. Joe watched it happen. Watched the American pilot bail out. Watched the parachute deploy. Watched the Zeros strafe the parachute. The pilot went limp in his harness. Rage flooded through Joe, but he forced it down. Rage got you killed. Patience won fights. Preacher, he called. We're going after the leader, the one with the red spinner. He's the smart one. Joe and Preacher climbed. The Zero with the red spinner, Yamada saw them coming, turned to engage. But instead of the expected aggressive rush, Yamada held back, waited, watched. Joe recognized what he was seeing. This wasn't a hot-headed young pilot. This was a veteran, someone who thought like he did. This was going to be interesting. Joe and Yamada circled each other at 18,000 feet while the battle raged below them. Neither wanted to commit first. Both were waiting for the other to make a mistake. Finally, Yamada made his move. He dove building speed, then pulled up hard into a climbing turn. The classic Zero maneuver. Used superior climbing power to get above and behind. Joe didn't follow. That's what Yamada expected. Instead, Joe half-rolled and pulled down, converting altitude into speed, then came back up on a different angle. Yamada saw it, adjusted, tried to get position. For 2 minutes they fought. Not with guns, with geometry. Each trying to predict where the other would be. Each trying to get that one clean deflection shot. Finally, Joe saw his opening. Yamada pulled into a tight left turn, but Joe had been counting. Yamada favored left turns. 3 times in the engagement, always left. So when Yamada turned left again, Joe was already firing at the right side of the turn circle, predicting Yamada would reverse. Yamada did reverse, right into Joe's fire. But Yamada was good, damn good. He rolled inverted at the last second. Joe's bullets missed him by inches. Yamada zoom climbed away using the Zero's superior power. Joe didn't chase, didn't have the speed or climb rate to catch him. They stared at each other across 2,000 feet of empty air. 2 hunters who just fought to a draw. Then Yamada waggled his wings, a salute, and dove away, disengaging. Joe watched him go, felt a strange mix of frustration and respect. That pilot, whoever he was the most skilled opponent Joe had ever faced. When they landed back at Henderson Field, Joe was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. That fight had taken everything he had. Preacher found him sitting on the wing of his Wildcat, staring at nothing. That Zero pilot, Preacher said. He was different. Yeah, Joe said quietly. He was hunting me the same way I hunt them. Think he'll be back? Joe nodded. I know he will. November 7th, 1942. Joe's squadron was scrambled to intercept a large Japanese strike force, 18 Zeros and 12 bombers. The battle was chaos from the start. Too many aircraft in too small a space. Joe shot down 2 Zeros in the first 5 minutes using his standard deflection technique. He was lining up a third when everything went wrong. He'd tunnel visioned on his target, forgotten to check his 6 o'clock, forgotten the first rule of survival. Always know what's behind you. Yamada had been waiting for exactly that mistake. The first indication Joe had was the sound of bullets hitting his aircraft. Loud, sharp cracks like someone taking a hammer to a tin roof. His engine exploded in a shower of oil and smoke. The control stick went dead in his hands. He was going down. Joe fought the plane, trying to keep it level long enough to bail out. The cockpit was filling with smoke. He couldn't see the instruments, couldn't see anything except gray haze and the occasional glimpse of jungle below. 8,000 feet. He was too low. Had to get out now. Joe unstrapped, jettisoned the canopy, and rolled the Wildcat inverted. Fell out, pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a jarring snap that felt like his shoulders were being pulled off. He floated down into the jungle, 3 miles from Henderson Field. Could hear the battle continuing above him. Could hear engines, explosions, the radio chatter from his squadron. But he was alone. He hit the jungle canopy hard. Branches broke. He fell through layers of vegetation and hit the ground with enough force to sprain his left ankle. Pain shot up his leg. Joe cut himself free of the parachute harness and looked around. Triple canopy jungle, hot, humid, and somewhere nearby Japanese patrols. He heard voices, Japanese searching. Joe did what came naturally. He found a hollow log, crawled inside, and became absolutely still. The way he'd waited for rabbits. Hours could pass. Didn't matter. Patience was survival. He waited in that log for 6 hours, heard Japanese soldiers walk past twice, didn't move, didn't breathe louder than he had to, just waited. Finally, after dark, he heard American voices. A Marine patrol. Over here, he called quietly. They found him, pulled him out of the log, got him back to Henderson Field. Dr. Helen Ashworth was waiting. She was the flight surgeon. 32 years old, smart, no nonsense. She'd been trying to ground Joe for weeks because he pushed too hard. Sprained ankle, she said after examining him. Mild concussion. You're grounded for 3 days minimum. 2 days, Joe countered. 3 days, Captain. That's not a negotiation, Joe wanted to argue. But Ashworth had a point. He'd made a mistake. Gotten tunnel vision. Almost died. He needed to heal. Needed to think. Fine, he said. 3 days. But 2 days later, on November 9th, Joe was back in the cockpit. He told Ashworth he was just doing a test flight, checking if his new plane handled right. Instead, he flew a combat mission hunting Japanese float planes. And he made the same mistake again. Fixated on his target. Didn't see the float plane's rear gunner. The gunner opened fire. Hit Joe's engine. For the second time in 3 days, Joe's plane was dying under him. But this time, he wasn't over the jungle. He was over the ocean, 10 miles from shore, in an area they called the Slot, the most shark-infested waters in the Pacific. Joe ditched the Wildcat as gently as he could. The plane hit hard. Water sprayed up over the canopy. The aircraft settled nose down and started sinking fast. Joe got the canopy open, scrambled out, inflated his life vest. The plane sank in less than 30 seconds. Gone. Just bubbles and oil on the surface. And then after about 15 minutes floating there, Joe saw the first fin. Then another. Then dozens. Sharks. Lots of them. Circling, Joe had survived the zero, survived the jungle. Now he was about to die to fish. The sharks circled for 4 hours, got closer, bumped him a few times. Testing. Joe splashed water, yelled, tried to look big and dangerous, but he was one man in the middle of the ocean, and they were dozens of apex predators. He thought about his father, about the farm, about dying before he had accomplished what he'd set out to do. His vision started to blur. The sun was setting. He was getting hypothermic despite the warm water. Starting to hallucinate. Saw his father standing on the water. Henry Keller, looking just like Joe, remembered him. Not your time yet, son, the hallucination said. Still rabbits to hunt. Then through the haze, Joe saw a canoe. A real canoe. Manned by native islanders. Sent by an Australian coast watcher who'd seen the plane go down. They paddled toward him, beating the water with their oars to scare the sharks away. They dragged him into the canoe. Exhausted, hypothermic, but alive. When they got him back to Henderson Field, Dr. Ashworth was waiting. She was furious. You flew against medical orders, she said, standing over his hospital cot. You could have died. But I didn't, Joe said weakly. Your luck will run out. Luck has nothing to do with it, Joe said. Then passed out, he woke up 2 days later with a raging fever. Malaria. The mosquitoes had finally gotten him. His temperature was 103 degrees. He'd lost 15 pounds in a week. Ashworth stood over him again. You're grounded, 2 weeks minimum, and this time if you disobey me, I'll have you arrested. Joe was too sick to argue. He lay in that hospital bed for 2 weeks shaking with fever while the war continued without him. Scarecrow visited every day, brought news. The flying circus was still flying, still winning. They'd gotten 3 more kills in Joe's absence. We're using everything you taught us, Scarecrow said. We don't need you to survive, boss. Joe felt conflicted. Pride that his students were succeeding, but also a strange fear that he was becoming obsolete. On the radio, Japanese communications were being intercepted. Translated. The ghost is gone, one pilot reported. Keller has not flown in 2 weeks. At Raboul, Yamada heard the news and felt surprisingly sadness. He'd wanted to face that American again, to test himself against a worthy opponent. If Keller was truly dead, the war had become less interesting. But on November 30th, 1942, Joe Keller discharged himself from the hospital against Ashworth's protests, against all medical advice. He weighed 152 pounds, down from 175. His skin was yellow from atabrine. He had a persistent fever of 100 degrees, but his eyes were still sharp and his hands were still steady. He climbed into his new Wildcat and flew. That afternoon, he intercepted a Japanese bomber formation, shot down 1-0 escort using a perfect deflection shot from a beam angle. The radio chatter from Japanese pilots said it all. Ghost has returned. Joe Keller wasn't done hunting, not by a long shot. And somewhere over the Pacific, Yamada heard the news and smiled. The worthy opponent had survived. The hunt would continue. But Joe was running out of time. The malaria was eating him from the inside. Every flight left him weaker, and the number that kept appearing in conversations was becoming impossible to ignore. 26, Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record, the holy grail of American fighter pilots. Joe Keller had 12 kills, 14 more to the record, 14 more to immortality. The question wasn't whether he could do it. The question was whether his body would hold out long enough to try. December 1942. The malaria that had nearly killed Joe Keller in November became his constant companion. Every 3 or 4 days, the fever would spike. His vision would blur. His hands would shake. Dr. Helen Ashworth kept detailed medical records, watching a strong man slowly deteriorate under the dual assault of tropical disease and relentless combat stress. But Joe kept flying, kept hunting. December 5th. Joe intercepted a formation of Zeros escorting bombers to Henderson Field. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. Joe got 1-0 with a difficult beam deflection shot, firing perpendicular to the target's flight path and leading it by what seemed like an impossible distance. The Zero flew into the bullet stream and its wing folded like paper. 13 kills total. The number started to matter. Not to Joe, but to everyone around him. The ground crews kept count. The other pilots whispered about it. Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 kills from World War I had stood for 24 years. No American pilot had even come close. Until now. December 12th. Joe was flying with a fever of 101 degrees. His flight suit was soaked with sweat before he even took off. But when 6 Zeros jumped his 4-plane division, Joe's instincts took over. His conscious mind might have been foggy with fever, but his hunter's brain was still sharp. He got 2 Zeros in the same engagement. The first with his standard high-angle deflection shot. The second while his vision was literally blurred from the fever. He couldn't see the Zero clearly, but he could see its contrail, could track its movement, could calculate where it would be. He fired at a ghost image. The Zero materialized in his gun sight exactly where he'd predicted and exploded. Scarecrow, flying on his wing, watched it happen and said over the radio, "Boss, that shouldn't be possible. You were shooting blind." Joe's response was slurred from the fever. Wasn't blind, could see the pattern. 15 kills total. When they landed, Sergeant Walsh had to help Joe out of the cockpit. The ground crew chief supported him as Joe's legs buckled. "Sir, you can barely stand." "Stood long enough," Joe muttered, then walked to the debriefing on willpower alone. December 18th, kill number 16 came during a mission Joe shouldn't have flown. His fever was 102 degrees that morning. Ashworth had ordered him to stay in bed. Joe waited until she left the medical tent, then got dressed and shot down a zero using pure muscle memory. Didn't remember the engagement afterward. The fever had stolen the memory, but the gun camera footage didn't lie. Perfect deflection shot. The zero never saw it coming. That night, Ashworth confronted him in the mess tent. "You're killing yourself," she said, her voice low and furious. "The malaria is destroying your body. Every time you fly with a fever, you're doing permanent damage." Joe looked at her with bloodshot eyes. "How many of my students are still alive because I taught them to shoot properly? That's not the point." "That's exactly the point, doctor. I'll fly until I can't. And when I can't anymore, they'll still know what I taught them. That's worth whatever happens to me." Ashworth stared at him for a long moment. Then she sat down across from him. "You're a stubborn fool, Captain Keller." "Yes, ma'am, runs in the family." She pulled out a notebook. "Then I'm documenting everything. Your condition, your performance, everything. Because after this war, someone needs to understand what happens when a man pushes past every reasonable limit. Maybe it'll help future pilots, or maybe it'll be a cautionary tale. Either way, it matters." Joe nodded slowly. "Fair enough." December 25th, 1942. Christmas on Guadalcanal. There was no combat that day. Weather kept both sides grounded. Joe sat in his tent, finally forced to rest, and wrote a letter home to his mother. "Ma, I'm doing what Dad taught me, leading the target. Missing isn't an option out here, just for different reasons than on the farm. I think he'd be proud. I hope you are too. The men here are good, young but learning fast. I'm teaching them everything I know. If something happens to me, they'll carry on. That brings me peace. Love, Joe." He sealed the letter but didn't send it immediately. Just held it, thinking about the farm, about Henry Keller teaching a 12-year-old boy how to hunt rabbits, about how those lessons had traveled across the world and were now keeping men alive in the deadliest air war in history. Preacher found him there holding the letter. "Thinking about home," Preacher asked. "Thinking about my father. He died when I was 19. Electrical accident on the farm." Preacher sat down. "What would he say if he could see you now?" Joe smiled slightly. "He'd say I was being stubborn and reckless and that I needed to take better care of myself. Then he'd ask if I was getting the job done. And when I said yes, he'd nod, and that would be that." "Sounds like a good man." "He was. Taught me everything that matters. How to be patient, how to lead a target, how to not waste ammunition, whether it's shotgun shells or 50 caliber rounds." Joe paused. "How to do what needs doing, even when it's hard." They sat in silence for a while, then Preacher said quietly, "You know we talk about the record. Rickenbacker's 26, you're at 16 now, 10 more. I don't care about records. I know you don't, but the men do. They need you to break it, need to see that we can win, that our way works." Joe looked at Preacher. "That's a lot of weight to put on one number." "Maybe, but it's true anyway." January 1943 brought a new intensity to the air war. The Japanese were reinforcing Guadalcanal, trying to retake the island. That meant more targets, more combat, more opportunities, and Joe's body was failing faster. January 2nd, kill 17. A zero that tried to boom and zoom on Scarecrow's flight. Joe caught it with a deflection shot at the top of its climb. The zero stalled and fell spinning. January 5th, kills 18 and 19. A double kill in the same engagement. Joe fired at 1-0, didn't wait to see it hit, immediately pivoted to the second and fired again. Both zeros went down within 8 seconds of each other. Scarecrow witnessed it and reported, "He's not even watching them die anymore. He fires, knows it's a hit, moves to the next target. It's like he can see the future." January 8th, kill 20. A hard deflection shot from below, firing up into a zero's turning circle. The most difficult angle. Joe made it look routine, but after he landed, he collapsed on the tarmac. His weight was down to 145 pounds. His fever was constant, now never dropping below 99 degrees. His hands shook when he wasn't flying. The only time they were steady was when he had a stick and throttle in them. Ashworth examined him and her face went pale. "Your body is shutting down, Joe. I can see it in your blood work. The malaria is destroying your red blood cells. You're malnourished despite eating. The fever is consuming you from the inside." "How long do I have?" Ashworth hesitated. "If you keep flying like this, weeks, maybe a month. If you rest proper hospital care, you might recover fully, but it would take months. The war doesn't wait months. Then you need to accept that you might not survive this, Joe nodded. I accepted that the day I arrived here. We all did. January 10th, kills 21 and 22. Joe's squadron jumped a formation of Zeros protecting a convoy. The battle was vicious. Preacher got one, Cherokee got one, and Joe got two with his now signature deflection shooting. 22 total kills, 4 away from Rickenbacker's record. The press got wind of it. A reporter arrived at Henderson Field, notebook in hand, asking questions. Can you break the record? What will it mean? How does it feel? Joe tried to avoid him, but the reporter cornered him outside the mess tent. Captain Keller, you're 4 kills away from tying the greatest American ace in history. Can you do it? I'm trying to win a war, not a contest. But the record means something, doesn't it? Proof that American pilots can beat the Japanese. Joe stopped walking, turned to face the reporter. You want to know what means something? 24 pilots in my squadron. All of them alive. All of them flying. All of them going home to their families when this is over. That's what means something, not some number from the last war. But that night, Major Duke Harrison pulled Joe aside. The men need you to break that record, Harrison said bluntly. Why, boss? Because it proves our way works. Your way, deflection shooting, thinking instead of reacting. It proves that skill and training can beat superior equipment. That's a lesson the whole military needs to learn. Joe was quiet for a moment. Then, so it's bigger than me. It always was. January 14th, the intelligence reports indicated a massive Japanese convoy was approaching Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express, they called it. 16 transport ships and 8 destroyers protected by an estimated 40 Zero fighters. It was the largest Japanese naval operation in months. If it succeeded, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be overwhelmed. The island would fall. Everything they'd fought for would be lost. Henderson Field would throw everything it had at the convoy. Every flyable aircraft. Every pilot who could still climb into a cockpit, including Joe Keller, who could barely climb out of bed. January 15th, 1943, 4:30 a.m. Joe woke in his cot with a fever of 104.2 degrees. His vision was blurry. His muscles ached. He tried to stand and nearly fell. Ashworth's orders were explicit. Bed rest, minimum 48 hours. Do not fly under any circumstances. But at 4:45 a.m., the scramble klaxon sounded. All aircraft, maximum effort. The convoy had been spotted. Joe lay there listening to pilots running to their planes, hearing engines starting, knowing his students were about to face the biggest battle of their lives. He thought about staying in bed, following orders, being smart. Then he thought about Scarecrow, 21 years old, good pilot but still learning. Thought about Preacher, solid, reliable, but sometimes hesitant. Thought about all of them, his students, his responsibility. Dad didn't get second chances on the farm, Joe thought. Neither do they. He forced himself to stand, got dressed, staggered to the flight line. Sergeant Walsh saw him coming and his face went white. Sir, you look like death. Then I'll fit right in. Walsh didn't argue, just helped Joe into the cockpit of a Wildcat, strapped him in, closed the canopy. Joe's hands were shaking on the stick. His vision kept blurring. But when he started the engine, when he felt the familiar rumble of the Wright R-1820 radio, something steadied inside him. This was what he was made for. This moment. This fight. Preacher pulled alongside in his own Wildcat, looked over, and saw Joe's condition even through the canopy. Joe, you shouldn't be up here. Joe's voice came back weak but determined. Neither should you. Let's go hunting. They took off at 5:15 a.m. 12 Wildcats from VMF 121, another 8 from other squadrons, 20 planes to face 40 Japanese fighters and sink a convoy that could change the war. The odds were suicide. But Joe Keller had spent his entire life beating long odds. At 8:47 a.m., they spotted the convoy, 16 ships in tight formation, and above them, like angry wasps, the Zeros, more than Joe had ever seen in one place. The sky was black with them. All aircraft, Joe said into his radio, his voice steadier now that combat was imminent. Remember your training. Don't chase, lead, fly in pairs, cover each other. Let's go to work. The B-17 high-altitude bombers went in first as planned, attacking from 20,000 feet, forcing the Zeros to climb, to look up to focus on the high threat. Then Joe led his Wildcats in at wave-top level, 200 feet above the ocean. So low the spray kicked up by the wind hit their windscreens. The Zeros didn't see them until it was too late. Joe picked his first target, a Zero climbing to engage the B-17s. The Japanese pilot was focused upward, not checking his six. Joe didn't aim at the Zero. He aimed at the point in space where the Zero's climb would take it in 2 seconds. Let it. Fired a 2-second burst. The Zero flew into the bullets like a bird flying into a fence. Exploded midair. 23 kills. But there was no time to celebrate. The sky was full of targets and threats. Scarecrow's voice came over the radio, tight with panic. I can't shake him. Zero on my 6, Joe looked. Found Scarecrow's plane. Found the Zero chasing him. The Japanese pilot was good, staying locked on, firing. Scarecrow, don't shake, Joe called. His voice was calm despite the fever, despite the chaos. I got him. Joe pulled his Wildcat into a hard climbing turn, not chasing the Zero, positioning himself where the Zero would be when it fired its next burst. The geometry lined up. The Zero committed to the attack. Joe fired. The Zero disintegrated. Pieces spinning into the ocean below, 24 kills, 2 away from the record. Thanks, boss, Scarecrow gasped. Another Zero dove on a different element, Cherokee's wingman. Joe saw it developing, saw the angles. He rolled inverted and pulled down a high-side gun pass, came down from above sun behind him. The Zero pilot never saw him. Joe fired a single perfect burst into the Zero's cockpit. The plane's nose dropped immediately. Pilot dead. It spiraled into the ocean. 25 kills. 1 away from tying Rickenbacker. Joe's radio was chaos now. Pilots calling contacts, calling kills, calling for help. But through it all, Joe heard something else. Preacher's voice. Joe, you've got one on you. 7 o'clock high. Joe looked back, saw the Zero diving, recognized the red spinner on the propeller. Yamada. The Japanese ace had been waiting, watching, looking for Joe specifically, and now he'd found him. Joe broke hard right. The Zero followed, anticipating, but Joe wasn't running. He was setting up. He rolled back left using the Wildcat's superior roll rate. Yamada stayed with him, but the geometry was changing. They merged head-on at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour. Both fired simultaneously. Joe felt impacts on his right leg, minor damage, but his shots missed Yamada entirely. The two planes flashed past each other, then both pulled up hard, trying to gain altitude. Yamada had the climb advantage. The Zero went up like a rocket. But Joe had something else. He had patience. He didn't chase the climb. Instead, he converted his speed into a shallow zoom, preserving energy. Yamada came around for another pass, but instead of diving immediately, he paused, studied Joe's position. This was the chess match. Two masters of aerial combat, each trying to predict the other's next 3 moves. Yamada dove. Joe turned into him head-on again. This time, Joe didn't fire, just held his course. Yamada, expecting fire, broke off early, zoomed back up. But in that break, in that moment of hesitation, Yamada had shown Joe something. He was being cautious, respectful, maybe even afraid. Joe pressed the advantage, climbed after Yamada. The Wildcat was slower, but Joe was timing it, counting seconds, watching Yamada's pattern. Yamada pulled into a climbing left turn, his signature move. Joe had seen it before in their previous engagement. But this time Joe was ready. He didn't follow the turn, didn't chase. Instead, he pulled his nose up, fired at empty sky at the point where Yamada's turn would complete. For a heartbeat, it looked like a complete miss, just tracers arcing through blue nothing. Then Yamada's Zero flew into them. But Yamada was as skilled as Joe. At the last instant, he saw the trap. Rolled inverted. Joe's bullets passed inches under his canopy. Yamada completed the roll dove away at full throttle, using the Zero's speed advantage to open distance. Joe didn't chase. Couldn't. The Wildcat was at its limits. The two pilots looked at each other across 2,000 feet of air. Joe saw Yamada's hand come up in the cockpit. A salute. Then Yamada dove toward his base, disengaging from the battle. Joe watched him go, felt that strange mix of frustration and respect again. That Japanese pilot was the best opponent he'd ever faced. Maybe the best he'd ever face. But the battle wasn't over. There were still zeros in the sky, still a convoy to sink. Joe scanned the chaos below, found a target, a roof float plane fighter trying to escape the battle heading back toward the Japanese fleet. The roof pilot saw Joe coming, pulled into a desperate climbing turn. This was the ultimate test. The deflection shot, the rabbit hunt, everything Joe had learned on those frozen South Dakota plains applied to three-dimensional aerial combat. Joe calculated. The roof was climbing at approximately 800 feet per minute, turning in a circle with a radius of about 1,000 feet. Airspeed maybe 180 miles per hour. Joe needed to lead it by 400 feet. 3 seconds of bullet flight time. He aimed at a point in the sky that seemed impossibly far ahead of the target. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Lead it more. You think you'll miss. Lead more. Joe fired. For 3 seconds, his tracers arced through empty blue sky. It looked like the worst miss in aviation history, a waste of ammunition. Then the roof climbed directly into the stream of bullets. The cockpit shattered. The pilot died instantly. The plane went into an uncontrolled tumble and hit the ocean. 26 kills. Joe's radio came alive with Preacher's voice. That's 26, boss. You tied the record. Joe's vision was blurring. The fever was spiking. He could barely see his instruments. Preacher's voice came again. Wait, no, Rickenbacker had 26. You just got your 26th. You broke it. Joe, you're the ace of aces. Joe tried to respond, tried to key his radio, but the fever hit him like a hammer. His vision went gray. His hands felt numb on the controls. He hallucinated his father standing on the wing of his Wildcat, Henry Keller looking just like he had that last day before the accident. Did you see Dad led him perfect? Just like the rabbits. I saw, son, I saw. Now get home. Preacher's voice cut through the hallucination. Joe, stay with me. We're heading back. Keep your plane level. I'll talk you through it. The flight back to Henderson Field was a blur. Joe flew on autopilot. His conscious mind was somewhere else lost in fever dreams. But his hands knew what to do. 30 years of muscle memory kept the plane flying. They landed at 11:23 a.m. Joe's wheels touched down hard, bounced twice. But the plane stayed on the runway. He tried to taxi to his revetment, couldn't remember how. The ground crew chief had to guide him with hand signals. When he shut down the engine, Joe couldn't get out of the cockpit. His hands wouldn't work. His legs wouldn't respond. Sergeant Walsh climbed up, saw Joe's condition, and immediately called for help. 2 crew members lifted Joe out of the cockpit. The entire base was waiting. Ground crews, pilots, mechanics, everyone who'd heard the radio chatter. They tried to carry Joe on their shoulders. A celebration. The ace of aces. The man who'd broken Rickenbacker's unbreakable record. Joe passed out halfway across the tarmac. He woke up 3 days later in the hospital tent. Dr. Ashworth was standing over him with an expression that mixed fury, relief, and professional concern. Your fever hit 105.3 degrees, she said without preamble. Another degree, and you would have died. Your body was literally cooking itself. Joe's mouth was dry. Did we win? Yes, you damn fool, you won. The convoy was destroyed. 12 transports sunk. 4 destroyers. And you got your record, 26 kills. You're officially the ace of aces. The men Peters had to ditch, engine trouble. He and his crew were picked up by PT boats. Everyone else made it back. 0 losses. Joe closed his eyes. Good. You're grounded, Ashworth said. Her voice was hard. Permanently. Medical discharge. I don't care if you argue. I don't care if you pull rank. I don't care if God himself comes down and tells you to fly. You're done. Joe wanted to protest, but he couldn't. His body had nothing left to give. He'd pushed past every limit, ignored every warning flown, when he should have been hospitalized. And now the bill had come due. Can I still walk? He asked quietly. Eventually, with rest, months of it. But you'll never be combat ready again. The malaria destroyed too much. I'm sorry, Joe. Joe nodded slowly. Don't be sorry. I did what I came to do. 3 days later, Major Duke Harrison visited. He stood at the foot of Joe's hospital bed holding a folder. Got something to show you, Harrison said, opening the folder. Inside was a training manual, fresh printed. The cover read, Advanced Deflection Shooting Techniques for Fighter Aircraft. Harrison flipped it open. The pages were full of diagrams, angles, calculations, all based on Joe's methods, all using his examples from combat. This is going out to every fighter squadron in the Pacific Fleet, Harrison said. From Pearl Harbor to Australia, every American fighter pilot will learn what you taught us. Joe looked at the manual, saw his father's lessons learned on a dirt-poor South Dakota farm, now codified into official military doctrine. That's more important than any record, Joe said quietly. The record matters too, Harrison said. You saved more lives than just the planes you shot down. Every pilot who uses this technique, every zero they kill instead of being killed by, that's because of you. Harrison stood at attention, then breaking protocol, he saluted. A superior officer saluting a subordinate, a gesture of pure respect. Thank you, Captain Keller, for showing us the way. January 20th, Joe was medevaced to a hospital in Australia, too weak to protest, too sick to care. But before he left, his squadron gathered around his cot. Scarecrow spoke for all of them. Everything we are as pilots, we learned from you. You didn't just teach us to shoot. You taught us to think. Bishop Preacher added, you taught us that fancy equipment doesn't win fights. Brains win fights. Even Tex the cocky Texan was subdued. You taught us that there's always a way. Even when the enemy is better, there's always a way. Cherokee, the quiet Native American pilot who'd become one of the squadron's best shooters, said simply, you taught us to hunt. Joe looked at each of them, these young men who'd been terrified rookies when he arrived, who were now confident, skilled pilots, who would survive the war and go home to their families because an old farmer had taught them how to lead a target. You don't need me anymore, Joe said. You've got everything I can teach you. Now you teach the next batch. Keep the knowledge moving forward. They flew him out on January 22nd. As the transport plane climbed away from Guadalcanal, Joe looked down at Henderson Field, the place that had been a graveyard when he arrived. That was now a fortress because pilots had learned to fight smarter instead of just harder. The plane banked east toward Australia, toward recovery, toward whatever came next. Joe Keller had flown his last combat mission, had gotten his last kill, had taught his last lesson in that particular classroom. But the lessons themselves would keep flying, keep fighting, keep saving lives. And that, Joe thought as he drifted into fever sleep, was worth more than any record could ever be. In March 1943, while Joe was still recovering in a hospital in Sydney, something unexpected happened. A request came through military channels. A Japanese POW wanted to meet him. The POW was Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada, the Zero Ace with the red spinner. The hunter who'd almost killed Joe twice. He'd been shot down by Scarecrow on January 20th using the exact deflection technique Joe had taught. Joe, still gaunt but recovering, agreed to the meeting. They met in a secure room at the POW facility. Yamada stood when Joe entered. Both men studied each other, two hunters who'd circled each other in the sky, who'd each nearly killed the other, who'd each respected the other's skill. Yamada spoke through a translator. You were an honorable opponent. You too, Joe said simply. Your students fought like you when they shot me down. They've learned your technique. That was the point. Yamada was quiet for a moment. Then through the translator, I was a rice farmer before the war, in Kyushu. I learned to fly because I was drafted, not because I wanted to. Joe felt something click. I was a wheat farmer in South Dakota. I learned to shoot hunting rabbits to feed my family during the Depression. The translator relayed this. Yamada's expression changed, a slight smile. We are the same. Farmers who became warriors. War made us enemies, Joe said, but we were never that different. They stood in silence for a moment, understanding passing between them without need for translation. Finally, Yamada bowed. Joe awkwardly bowed back. I hope you see your farm again, Joe said. The translator relayed it. Yamada nodded. And you yours. They never met again. But years later, Joe would learn that Yamada survived the war, returned to his farm in Kyushu, raised his daughter, taught mathematics at a local school. Two farmers who'd met in the sky with guns, who'd nearly killed each other, who'd both gone home to the land they'd left. May 18, 1943, the White House. Joe Keller, now weighing 155 pounds, still yellow-skinned from atabrain, stood in front of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His mother, Martha, had been flown in from South Dakota. She stood beside him, tears in her eyes, as the president draped the Medal of Honor around her son's neck. The citation praised his dauntless courage and incomparable combat skill. But Roosevelt's private words were different. "Captain Keller, they tell me you learned to shoot hunting rabbits." "Yes, Mr. President." "I think," Roosevelt said with a slight smile, "you've moved up to bigger game." Joe smiled back. "Rabbits were harder, sir. They zigzag more." After the ceremony, Martha held her son close. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. Joe finally let the tears come. "I kept his lessons, Ma. Didn't waste any shots." The war continued without Joe Keller. He spent 1943 and 1944 on war bond tours telling his story, promoting the deflection shooting technique, always deflecting personal glory to his students, to his father, to the men still fighting. In 1945, when the war ended, Joe returned to South Dakota, to the farm, to the land his father had worked, that his grandfather had worked. He walked the same fields where he had hunted rabbits as a boy, where his father had taught him to lead the target. Those lessons taught on a Depression-era farm had crossed the Pacific, had changed military doctrine, had saved thousands of lives. Joe Keller never flew combat again. The malaria had ended that. But he didn't need to. His legacy was already written in the training manuals, in the pilots who used his techniques, in the families of men who came home because someone had taught them to think like hunters instead of warriors. In 1946, Joe was elected to the South Dakota State Legislature. In 1954, he became governor, the youngest in state history at 39. His platform was simple: leadership learned in battle, humility learned on the farm. He served his state the same way he'd served his country, not seeking glory, just doing what needed to be done. In 1955, as governor, Joe was invited to Japan as part of post-war reconciliation efforts. To his surprise, Takeshi Yamada attended the reception. They shook hands for the cameras. Two former enemies, two farmers who'd gone to war. In private, Yamada told Joe through a translator, "My daughter is 10 now. I teach her to grow rice. You had children." "No, never married, but I had students. Taught them to flight, to think. Some of them still write to me." "Students are children of the mind," Yamada said. Joe nodded. "Tell your daughter about the war. Tell her we fought with honor, both sides." "I will." They parted with mutual respect. Two men who tried to kill each other, who'd both survived, who'd both gone home. In 1985, Joe Keller, now 70 years old, was invited to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. They wanted him to see the new F-14 Tomcat fighters. A young instructor showed him the aircraft, explained the radar, the missiles, the computers. "Sir, we still teach deflection shooting. They call it lead computing now. The computers help, but the principle is the same." "Fancy name for shoot where it's going," Joe said. A young pilot approached, awed to meet the legendary ace. "Is it true you learned from hunting rabbits?" Joe smiled. "Every skill you need in life, you can learn from simpler things. You just have to pay attention." January 1st, 2003. The farm in South Dakota. Joe Keller, now 87, sat on the porch with his grandnephew, a boy of 14. "Uncle Joe, can you teach me to hunt?" Joe looked at the boy, saw himself at that age, before the war, before everything. "Thought you'd never ask." They walked into the cold January morning, the same fields Joe had hunted 80 years ago, where his father had taught him the lessons that would travel around the world. A jackrabbit appeared, zigzagged across the frozen field. "How do I hit it?" the boy asked. "It's so fast." Joe's voice was soft but clear. "Don't aim at it. Aim where it's going. Lead it. Lead it more. Trust yourself." The boy shot, missed. "Again," Joe said. "More lead." The boy shot again, hit. "It works," the boy exclaimed. "Always has," Joe said. That night, Joe Keller died peacefully in his sleep. Natural causes, old age, a life fully lived. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery on January 5th, 2003. Full military honors, hundreds of Marines, veterans who'd learned his technique, students of students. The ripple effect of one farmer's wisdom spreading across generations. Scarecrow was there, 83 years old, leaning on a cane. Cherokee, three other surviving members of the flying circus. From Japan, a letter arrived. From Yamada's daughter, Yuki. Her father had died 2 years earlier, but he'd told her to send this if Joe passed. My father said to tell you two farmers met in the sky and both chose to go home. That was the real victory. Thank you for your honor. Preacher's son gave the eulogy, reading words his father had written before passing in 1907. Joe Keller didn't beat the zero with technology. He beat it with a farmer's brain and a father's lessons. He taught us that the best solutions come from the simplest places. That experience beats youth. That wisdom trumps equipment. That thinking wins fights. Three FA-18 Hornets flew missing man formation, the sound of their engines echoing across Arlington. Joe's gravestone was simple: Joseph Henry Keller, Captain, United States Marine Corps, 1915-2003 Medal of Honor, ace of aces, 26 victories. He led the target. Below that, added by the family, a second line: he taught us to hunt. The sun set over Arlington that day, casting long shadows across the graves of warriors. And somewhere in South Dakota, on a frozen farm, jackrabbits still zigzagged across the fields, still teaching anyone patient enough to watch, still showing that the simplest lessons are often the most powerful, and that a father teaching his son to hunt, to lead the target, to not waste ammunition, could change the course of history. Sometimes the greatest warriors are made on farms, not in academies. Sometimes the experts are wrong and the farmer is right. And sometimes, just sometimes, the answer to the most complex problem is the lesson a 12-year-old boy learned because his family needed to eat. Joe Keller proved it. His students carried it forward. And the lesson still flies today every time a pilot leads a target instead of chasing it. The rabbit hunter's war had ended, but the rabbit hunter's wisdom lives on.